Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. True fans of the Harry Potter books know that Ron Weasley is far more than just comic relief or the odd one out in the Golden Trio. He is its heart, a loyal friend, and a true hero. Sadly, the films often reduced his character to jealousy, insecurity, and one-liners. That's why so many viewers underestimate Ron, but in the books he displays incredible courage, loyalty, and inner strength. Today, we're revisiting the moments that prove Ron Weasley is a hero who deserves far more recognition. Enjoy the journey. Number 1. Helped Gryffindor win the Quidditch Cup. In 5th year, Ron takes on the role of keeper for the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Despite constant pressure and taunting from the Slytherins, including their cruel chant, "Weasley is our king," he doesn't give up. He battles not just his opponents on the field, but also his own insecurities. And when the final match of the season arrives, Ron rises to the occasion. He becomes a solid wall in front of the hoops and secures Gryffindor's long-awaited victory. The fans rewrite the mocking song into a triumphant anthem. Ronald Weasley is our king. Ronald Weasley is our hero. He guards the hoops just like a pro. May he never let one go. This could have been Ron's big moment in the film, but unfortunately, Quidditch was cut entirely from Order of the Phoenix, and with it, one of the most defining victories of his character. Number 2 became a prefect in 5th year. Many expected Harry to be named prefect. Even Harry himself assumed he'd get the badge, but it goes to Ron, and this moment is more than a school formality. It's a major leap for a boy who spent his whole life in the shadow of his brothers. "I never thought it would be me," he says, shaking his head in disbelief. Ron can't believe he was actually chosen, but the recognition boosts his confidence and lays the foundation for his personal growth. He receives a new broomstick, starts believing in himself, and begins to emerge not as Harry's sidekick, but as someone worthy of leadership and respect. Number 3 ignored Percy when he tried to turn him against Harry. Also in Order of the Phoenix, the Ministry of Magic tries to brand Harry as a liar. Ron's older brother Percy sides with the establishment. He sends Ron a letter congratulating him on becoming a prefect, but also urges him to distance himself from Harry. Ron doesn't hesitate. He tears the letter to shreds in front of Harry without a second thought. He's the world's biggest git. This wasn't just anger. It was loyalty in action. Ron made it clear his friendship with Harry was unshakable, even if it meant standing against his own family. Number 4. Stood up to Snape for Hermione. Snape in the books is even crueler and more cutting than in the films. He humiliates students, especially Gryffindors, and particularly Hermione. In Prisoner of Azkaban, he publicly insults her for answering too many questions. "You insufferable know-it-all, that's 5 points from Gryffindor for being an unbearable nuisance." Hermione lowers her head, burning with shame, and then Ron stands up for her. "You asked a question, she knows the answer," Ron snaps. "Why ask if you don't want to be told?" In the film, this moment is twisted. Ron laughs along with Snape. That completely contradicts his book character. In the books, Ron always stands by his friends, even when it takes real courage. Number 5. Protected Harry from Sirius Black. When the trio first confront Sirius Black in the Shrieking Shack, they believe he's a dangerous murderer. And even though Ron has already been injured, dragged away by Sirius in dog form, he still staggers between him and Harry. "If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too," Ron shouts, trembling with pain. It wasn't bravado, it was raw bravery. Ron didn't know the truth about Sirius, but he was ready to die protecting his friend. In the movie, this line is given to Hermione, erasing one of Ron's most heroic moments. Number 6. Volunteered to go after Nagini in the Shrieking Shack. In Deathly Hallows, Harry learns that Voldemort is hiding with Nagini in the Shrieking Shack. Someone must risk everything to destroy the snake, one of the final Horcruxes. Ron understands that Voldemort is waiting for Harry, which means Harry can't go, so Ron steps up. "You stay here and look after Hermione," he says. I'll go and get her. This is a moment of true maturity. Ron fully understands the danger and still chooses to act. He risks himself for the greater good. Number 7. Fought Draco Malfoy. During a Quidditch match. It started with Malfoy's usual poison, sneering from the stands, mocking Harry's broom, calling Neville names. Crabbe and Goyle laughed on cue. But that day, Ron wasn't in the mood to let it go. In Philosopher's Stone, when Malfoy crosses the line, Ron doesn't just argue, he swings. Ron had leapt forward, fists raised, and had landed on Malfoy Vesoid. Rowling writes, there were no spells, no wands, just fists and fury. He didn't wait for permission. He saw Malfoy humiliating his friends and acted. Neville tried to hold him back. He couldn't. Ron wasn't thinking about consequences. He was thinking about loyalty. For all his self-doubt, he never hesitated when it came to defending others. He took a black eye for it. Maybe a detention too. But he never apologized. That moment, rough and impulsive, revealed the core of Ron Weasley. He fights when it matters, not for glory, for people, for friends. Number 8. Supported Harry during the dueling club incident. The dueling club was supposed to be fun, harmless wand work under Lockhart's clueless supervision. But when Harry spoke to the snake, everything changed. The room fell silent. Whispers started. He's a Parselmouth. In the eyes of the school, that meant only one thing, a connection to Salazar Slytherin. The fear spread quickly. Even students from Gryffindor began to back away. But Ron didn't. He stayed beside Harry. When others looked at him with suspicion, Ron asked real questions. You didn't know you were speaking Parseltongue? He asked, not in judgment, but in confusion, trying to understand. J.K. Rowling gives Ron no dramatic line, no grand defense, but he never joins the doubt. He walks with Harry through the corridors when others avoid him. He keeps talking to him as usual. When Hermione starts researching, Ron helps. And when Harry wonders aloud if he could truly be connected to Slytherin, it's Ron who reminds him, you're not, you're you. In that swirl of fear and rumour, Ron's belief never wavers. It's one of the earliest tests of their friendship, and he passes without hesitation. Number 9. Stood by Lupin despite his secret. When word spread that Professor Lupin was a werewolf, fear crept into the halls of Hogwarts. Whispers followed him like shadows. Students stared. Some teachers pulled away. In the films, this shift is barely shown, but in the book, the reaction is real, and Ron's response stands out. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't join in. He simply says what he believes, that Lupin was the best defense against the dark arts teacher they'd ever had. He was brilliant, Ron says flatly, when others begin to talk. It isn't dramatic, it's honest. Ron doesn't care that Lupin turned into a wolf once a month. He remembers the boggart lessons, the grindylows, the way Lupin treated them with respect. That was what mattered. When Lupin resigns, Ron is genuinely upset. It's not right, he mutters. He didn't do anything wrong. He sees the injustice, the hypocrisy. And unlike many adults, he doesn't hide behind rules or fears. Ron's reaction matters because it shows how much he's grown. He came from a world that feared dark creatures. He'd heard stories, warnings, but when it came time to decide what kind of man Remus Lupin really was, Ron didn't hesitate. He judged him by his kindness, not by his curse. That kind of quiet clarity is rare, and it's why Ron's loyalty doesn't just belong to his friends. It extends to anyone who deserves it. Number 10. Felt sympathy for Winky the house elf. Winky sat in the Hogwarts kitchens, her eyes red and swollen, her tiny hands trembling around a butterbeer bottle. She'd been dismissed, cast out by Barty Crouch for something she didn't do. And though Hermione led the charge for house elf rights, Ron was the one who paused, looked at Winky, and didn't laugh. He didn't shrug it off. He frowned. That's not fair, he muttered, watching her sob. She was loyal. It wasn't a grand speech. It was quiet anger, real sympathy. Ron often clashed with Hermione over SPEW. He rolled his eyes, teased her, called it pointless. But when faced with Winky, broken, drunk, and clinging to a master who no longer wanted her, he couldn't pretend it didn't matter. He saw the injustice. He didn't write petitions or lead marches, but his instincts were good. He saw pain, and it got to him. He didn't excuse Crouch's cruelty. "If my dad did that to Dobby, I'd be furious," he said. And he meant it. That moment revealed something the films never showed. Ron wasn't indifferent. He cared, just in his own way, not loud, not righteous, but honest. Winky's story pulled something out of him. Empathy, decency, the deep Weasley sense of what's right. It proved that Ron's heart was bigger than his jokes and louder than his doubts. He didn't have to join Hermione's cause to show that he understood why it mattered. Number 11 fought bravely at the Ministry of Magic. The Department of Mysteries was a maze of spinning doors, crashing glass, and voices raised in panic. Death Eaters surrounded them. Spells flew through the air like arrows. In the movie, it's mostly Harry and Hermione who stand out. Ron, meanwhile, fades into the background. But in the book, he fights, injured, confused, and still refusing to stop. When one of the brains from the tank wraps around him, its tendrils crawling over his skin and whispering madness, Ron doesn't beg for help. He fights to stay conscious, to keep going, even as the room spins. J.K. Rowling describes him stumbling, casting jinxes at shadows, yelling nonsense through clenched teeth. He's hit by a hex that disorients him, warping his sense of reality. Ron was giggling weakly on the floor, covered in tendrils. But even then he clutches his wand. Even then he tries to stand. It's not glamorous. There's no spotlight on him, but it's raw, messy courage, precisely the kind of bravery the books are full of and the films too often forget. Ron doesn't need applause. He just needs his friends to be safe. That's why he keeps fighting. He doesn't ask for rescue. He becomes part of the rescue. When they finally escape, Ron is one of the most battered. But he made it through, not because he's the strongest, because he refused to give up. In that chaos, when fear could have broken him, he chose loyalty. He chose love, and that's what made him brave. Number 12 encouraged Neville in potions class. Neville Longbottom's hands trembled as he reached for the next ingredient. Professor Snape prowled the dungeon like a shark scenting blood, and Neville, always his favourite prey, was a heartbeat away from disaster. This wasn't new. Snape's sarcasm, his cruel remarks, his contempt for Neville's every move, it had become a routine. But in the Goblet of Fire, something shifted. As Neville struggled with the potion, it was Ron Weasley, not Hermione, not even Harry, who leaned over and quietly offered help. "You've added the Valerian root too early," Ron muttered, keeping his eyes forward. It wasn't loud enough for Snape to hear. It wasn't showy, just a quick whisper at the right moment. Ron didn't make Neville feel stupid. He didn't mock him. He simply guided him. For Neville, who was used to failure and embarrassment in potions class, that support mattered. It gave him just enough confidence to keep going. Neville's potion didn't explode. It didn't change colour in the wrong way. For once, it wasn't a catastrophe. When Snape scowled and moved on, Neville exhaled shakily, and Ron gave him a tiny nod. J.K. Rowling doesn't linger on this exchange, but it says everything. Ron noticed Neville's struggle and cared enough to help without making a scene. In a class ruled by fear and humiliation, Ron gave Neville a rare moment of peace. This scene didn't make it into the films. They focused on spectacle, on big plot points. But here, in the quiet corner of the dungeon, Ron Weasley did something brave. He saw someone suffering and reached out, not because it would earn him praise, not because he was told to, just because that's who he was. Not all heroes carry wands in battle. Some pass ingredients, whisper advice, and help a boy believe, just for a moment, that he isn't hopeless. Number 13 comforted Harry after the maze. When Harry returned from the graveyard holding Cedric's lifeless body, the great hall fell into silence. Screams still echoed in his ears. The Triwizard Cup was a portkey. Voldemort had returned. Everything had changed. Yet, in those first moments of confusion and disbelief, the films turned their attention to Dumbledore, to chaos, to spectacle. But in the book, Harry's pain is quiet. And so is Ron's support. After the crowd dispersed, after Madame Pomfrey did what she could, Harry was alone. Or so he thought. Ron appeared, not with dramatic words or forced comfort, but simply with presence. "Harry, you all right?" he asked quietly, his voice shaking. Harry didn't answer. He couldn't. But it didn't matter. Ron didn't need an answer. He sat down near him. That was all. Just being there. No judgment, no pressure. J.K. Rowling writes this moment with restraint. That's what makes it powerful. Ron had stood aside to let Harry come in first, his face pale and shocked-looking. Ron's silence meant more than any speech. He looked at Harry not as a spectator, but as someone who understood, even without details. He knew his friend had faced something horrifying, and instead of prying or offering pity, he offered what Harry needed most: quiet loyalty. The films missed this. They gave the comfort role to Hermione, but in the books, Ron's reaction isn't heroic or loud, it's real. He shows up when Harry's broken, when there are no right words, and he doesn't try to fix it, he just stays. That moment said everything about their friendship and about Ron's growth. Not every act of bravery happens on a battlefield. Some happen in silence beside a friend who can't speak. Number 14 came up with the escape plan from the Ministry. Of all the moments that revealed the quiet courage of Ron Weasley, few were as overlooked in the film adaptations as the escape from the Ministry of Magic. Buried within the pages of The Deathly Hallows is a sequence that speaks volumes about Ron's growth, his loyalty, and his sharp thinking under pressure. While the cinematic version showcases Harry's improvisation and Hermione's quick spellwork, it glosses over Ron's decisive role in their survival. This omission is more than an editing choice. It erases a key instance where Ron stepped up not as a sidekick, but as a leader. The trio's infiltration of the Ministry was reckless by necessity. Using Polyjuice Potion, they transformed into Ministry employees, Harry as Runcorn, Hermione as Mafalda Hopkirk, and Ron as Reginald Catamol. While Harry and Hermione carried out their missions within the oppressive corridors of a regime teetering on the edge of authoritarian collapse, Ron found himself alone, improvising in the Ministry's depths. He was thrust into a role for which he had no script, and it was in this chaos that Ron's instincts began to shine. Within moments of arriving, Ron's borrowed identity became a liability. Reg Catamol was under suspicion for having a Muggle-born wife, and his presence in the Ministry that day had been unplanned. Ron used this to his advantage, feigning confusion and panic, behaviors consistent with a man worried about his family. "They told me to come fix the rain in Yaxley's office," he stammered, buying himself time and freedom of movement. It wasn't just acting, it was strategy. He understood the social dynamics at play, the fear of superiors, and the crumbling professionalism within the corrupted Ministry. In the film, Ron is mostly seen muttering anxiously and waiting, but in the book, he was already working to dismantle the regime from within. He made his way into the Department of Magical Maintenance, where he encountered a room full of wizard custodians, overworked, underpaid, and terrified of saying the wrong thing. Here, Ron quietly absorbed the flow of information. Who was being watched? Who had gone missing? Which areas were off limits? He pieced together a map of the building in his mind, not through spells, but through careful observation and social awareness. It was Ron who suggested creating a diversion when the mission began to unravel. The trio was cornered in the atrium after rescuing Mary Catamol from her sham trial. The golden statues had come to life, the air thick with suspicion, and the exit was crawling with Death Eaters. Harry, disguised as Runcorn, had drawn too much attention. Hermione was shielding Mary, panicked and defensive. It was Ron who slipped away unnoticed, navigating the back hallways and service passages, searching for something, anything, that could give them a chance. He found it near the Ministry's transportation department, a disused fireplace connected to the Flu network. The system had been monitored, but Ron spotted a critical error in the guard rotation. 2 sentries had left their posts briefly to investigate a disturbance Ron himself had staged minutes earlier, a burst water pipe in one of the lower levels. "I saw an opportunity," Ron later said, "and I took it." It was classic Weasley mischief weaponized as survival. But Ron didn't stop there. He knew that even with a clear exit, they needed cover. He conjured a fog charm that billowed through the corridor, mimicking a maintenance mishap. To those nearby, it looked like the building itself was malfunctioning. Chaos broke out, yelling, footsteps, orders barked, and disobeyed. In the middle of this confusion, Ron sprinted back toward the others, weaving through the smoke like someone who had grown up dodging hexes in the burrow's backyard. He reached them just as a wizard in black robes began to approach Hermione. Without waiting for orders, Ron blasted a wooden bench into the path of the oncoming wizard, knocking him over. "Go!" he shouted, dragging Hermione and Mary toward the fireplace he had found. Harry, ever the hero, was about to engage the other guards, but Ron pulled him back. "We're not here to fight. We're here to vanish." The line wasn't dramatic. It was pragmatic. This wasn't Gryffindor glory. This was battlefield logic. Moments later, they dove into the Flu flames, one after another. The Ministry behind them erupted in alarms. They had made it, but only just. And in that escape, it wasn't Harry's scar or Hermione's intellect that had led them through the fire. It was Ron's presence of mind, his ability to assess and react, that saved them. Yet in the movie adaptation, this entire chain of events is compressed, sanitized, and reshaped into something far less nuanced. What the book reveals is that Ron's instincts are grounded in compassion. He didn't just want to escape, he wanted to make sure Mary Cattermole, a woman he had never met, got out alive. This wasn't just about breaking into the Ministry, it was about breaking its illusion of power. Ron's actions in that moment weren't just clever. They were noble. He didn't think of himself as a hero, which made him even more of one. Even his knowledge of the Ministry layout, something Hermione had prepared them for through maps and planning, was enhanced by Ron's own improvisation. He remembered details that weren't in the schematics. "There's a shortcut through the Hall of Prophecies," he muttered at one point, veering off course. It turned out to be a brilliant detour that kept them one step ahead of pursuit. Hermione would later admit that she hadn't accounted for active patrols, but Ron's memory of their previous journey through the Department of Mysteries gave them a crucial edge. Number 15 cared for Hermione after Malfoy Manor. After their escape from the Malfoy Manor, the world felt colder, darker, heavier. The group had fled in chaos, with Harry and Ron clutching the battered body of Dobby and Hermione weak and trembling in their arms. The beach near Shell Cottage, where they apparated, offered no comfort that night, only wind and waves, as if the sea itself mourned with them. Ron Weasley barely let go of Hermione's hand. Her skin, usually warm and freckled with life, was pale and clammy, smeared with blood where Bellatrix Lestrange had carved mudblood into her arm with a cursed blade. But it wasn't the injury that haunted Ron, it was her silence. Ron had seen Hermione cry before, over house elves, over exams, even over Harry's recklessness, but he had never seen her this quiet. Her eyes were open, but they were distant, unfocused. When Bill and Fleur welcomed them into Shell Cottage, Ron stayed close, not just in the room, but beside her, always. He helped her out of her bloodied clothes and into a clean jumper with Fleur's help, turning away not out of embarrassment, but respect. When Hermione finally lay down, wrapped in blankets and silence, Ron sat on the floor beside her, leaning against the wall, eyes never leaving her. He didn't say much. There were no grand declarations or panicked outbursts. Instead, Ron asked her quietly if she needed water. He brought her tea, though it remained untouched. When she winced in her sleep, clutching at her arm or whimpering from the memory of the Cruciatus curse, he reached across and placed his hand lightly over hers until the tremors stopped. In those moments, Ron Weasley did what no spell could accomplish. He anchored her. The films showed a cut, a brief scream, a trembling Hermione, but the book gave her pain space to breathe, and Ron became the only balm she had. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, J.K. Rowling wrote, Ron's voice was gentle as he helped Hermione to sit up. She looked dreadful, her face white and strained. These details mattered. Ron didn't rush her. He didn't force her to speak. He just stayed. For hours, days. Hermione, always so composed, had shattered under Bellatrix's cruelty. The Carrows had never broken her. Even Umbridge, with her pink horror and blood quills, hadn't reached this depth of evil. But Bellatrix was different. She took pleasure in pain. She wanted to humiliate. She carved identity into flesh. And for Ron, who had long watched Hermione fight back with books and wit, this was an unspeakable violation. At night, when Fleur lit candles around the room and the wind from the sea pressed against the cottage walls, Ron would sit with Hermione and whisper comforts that weren't meant to be heard. He murmured things about the Burrow, about her parents, about the time she had punched Draco Malfoy. Sometimes he just reminded her she was safe, that Bellatrix was far away, that she wasn't alone. He never once left her to sleep alone. When Harry wandered restlessly around the cottage, talking to Griphook and Ollivander, plotting their next move, Ron declined to join in. He didn't care about goblin politics or wand loyalty in those days. All he cared about was Hermione's breath, how shallow it was, whether it hitched when she moved, whether she winced when brushing her hair. He helped her eat, spooning soup into her hand when she was too weak to hold the bowl steady. He never made a fuss of it. He didn't expect thanks. There was a particular night when the storm outside reached its peak. Rain battered the windows like fists and the firelight flickered. Hermione had finally fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep, but Ron didn't move. He sat with her head on his lap, brushing his fingers through her curls slowly. His eyes were red, not just from lack of sleep, but from helpless rage. He had wanted to kill Bellatrix. In fact, Harry had to hold him back during the chaos in the manor. But now his vengeance had softened into something quieter, protection. The scars Bellatrix left weren't just on Hermione's skin, they clung to her spirit. She flinched at sudden noises. Her laughter, once bright and frequent, vanished. Even her posture changed. She hunched forward, arms always close to her body, as if to shield herself from a blade that might come again. Ron never commented on it. He adjusted to her new silences, let her heal in her own time. And when she began to read again, barely a page at a time, he sat beside her and turned the pages so she didn't have to. In one passage that never made it into the films, Harry notices Ron with Hermione and thinks, Ron looked like he hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, but he wouldn't leave her side. This detail matters because it paints a Ron that too many miss. A Ron who, despite his temper, despite his insecurities, loved without condition. He had grown. The boy who once mocked Hermione for being a know-it-all now held her hand through trauma. The boy who stormed off during the Horcrux hunt had returned stronger, steadier. Their love was never loud. Ron didn't make speeches or grand gestures, but when Hermione dropped her spoon, trembling from the pain in her arm, Ron picked it up and kissed her fingers. When she cried in the dark and whispered that she couldn't sleep, he held her until she drifted off. When she finally asked if she'd ever be normal again, he told her she was more than normal. She was Hermione, and he meant it. Even Fleur, cool and distant with her guests, noticed the devotion. She told Bill one morning in her accented English that the boy with the red hair is very gentle with her, very loyal. It wasn't just love, it was respect. Ron never treated Hermione like something broken. He treated her like someone precious. Number 16 helped Harry destroy the Elder Wand. Ron stood in the background when Harry faced his greatest trials, but he was never absent. In the final moments of the Deathly Hallows, as the world slowly began to shift from darkness to dawn, it wasn't just Harry who carried the weight of impossible choices. Ron, often underestimated and overshadowed, took one more step into the role that had always been his to play: steady anchor, moral compass, the quiet reminder of what mattered most. The films failed to capture a moment that, while devoid of spectacle, held a power greater than most spells ever could. In the book, it wasn't just Harry who considered the fate of the Elder Wand. Ron Weasley was the one who whispered the truth into the silence, offering not advice, but trust, urging Harry not to seek strength in relics of the dead. In the ruins of what had once been the battleground of Hogwarts, the three friends stood surrounded by debris, the faint cries of the wounded still echoing from beyond the stone walls. Voldemort was gone. The war was over. And yet something lingered in Harry's hand, a symbol of invincibility, a temptation dressed as destiny. The Elder Wand pulsed with ancient power, its allegiance now bound to Harry through death and sacrifice. The temptation was not one of arrogance, but of uncertainty. What if something else rose in Voldemort's place? What if he could fix things, truly fix them, with just a flick of this wand? What if this time he could make the world right? Ron saw it. He always saw it. Even when he didn't say much, even when his own doubts clouded his thoughts, Ron understood Harry better than anyone. Hermione offered logic, history, consequences. Ron offered instinct. He looked at the wand in Harry's hand and knew the danger wasn't the object. It was the dream it offered. "That wand's more trouble than it's worth," he said, in the book, not harshly, not dramatically. It wasn't a command, just a reminder, and quite honestly, I've had enough trouble for a lifetime. This single line was not a throwaway comment. It was a moment of grounding. Ron, who had nearly died for this quest, who had seen his brother fall, who had watched his home burn and his mother scream, was choosing to let go. He wasn't enchanted by the promise of ultimate power. He wasn't interested in becoming someone else. He didn't want to know what the Elder Wand could do for him. He wanted to be done with it all. And by sharing that perspective without pushing, without demanding, he gave Harry permission to walk away too. The film chose to depict Harry alone, walking to a wooden bridge and snapping the wand in half with quiet resolve, tossing its pieces into the abyss. It was a poetic image, but it lost the shared burden. It erased the small, crucial role Ron played in shaping that choice. In the book, Ron's suggestion to return the wand to Dumbledore's tomb carried the essence of respect, closure, and humility. It wasn't about destruction, but about restoring balance, letting the past rest, not forcing it to be rewritten. Harry's decision to break the wand came after that moment, when he chose not just to reject power, but to sever the possibility of anyone seeking it again. That missing scene, subtle as it was, carried the theme that ran through Ron's entire arc. He wasn't the comic relief, the sidekick, the lucky tag-along. He was the one who helped others see what mattered. When he left during their hunt for Horcruxes, it wasn't out of weakness, but fear of insignificance, of losing his place. But when he returned, he brought with him more than loyalty. He brought clarity. He was the first to stand by Harry's side in that final stand, the one to shout his name as Voldemort struck with the killing curse. He wasn't a follower. He was a brother in every sense of the word. When Harry stood with the Elder Wand, the weight of it felt unbearable. Not because of its physical form, but but because of what it represented, the lives it had ended, the lies it had told, the blood it had drawn. Dumbledore had failed to resist it. Grindelwald had chased it like a fevered dream. Voldemort had butchered for it. And now Harry held it, not as a reward, but as a burden. Ron's quiet voice was the counterspell to all that darkness. He didn't tell Harry what to do. He simply reminded him that there was a life waiting beyond power. It was always Ron who brought Harry back to himself. At 11 years old, he was the first to make Harry laugh. At 12, he drove a flying car into a tree for him. At 13, he stood petrified in front of Sirius Black, ready to die if it meant protecting Harry. At 14, he made mistakes, was jealous, bitter, but always came back. At 15, he stood in the Department of Mysteries, one shaking, heart steady. At 16, he defended Ginny's honor and fought Death Eaters in the Astronomy Tower. At 17, he destroyed a Horcrux, nearly drowned, and offered up the Sword of Gryffindor to a friend who needed it more. And at the end, he helped Harry bury power where it could never rise again. This missing moment is a distillation of what makes Ron essential. He doesn't seek the spotlight. He doesn't lecture. He simply shows up when it matters most. In that final decision where the fate of the Elder Wand could have gone in any direction, into a museum, a vault, a ministry display, it was Ron who reminded them both that some things are better left buried. Some victories come not from winning, but from refusing to play the game. Number 17 supported Ginny after the diary incident. In the aftermath of the terrifying events that unfolded within the chambers of Hogwarts during Ginny Weasley's first year, the emotional damage ran deeper than the physical. Most eyes were fixed on Harry Potter, the boy who had once again triumphed against an unspeakable evil. The professors were occupied with restoring order to the school. The students, grateful to be safe again, resumed their routines with a kind of forced normalcy. But for Ginny Weasley, the nightmare didn't end with Tom Riddle's diary being destroyed. She carried within her the invisible weight of guilt, an unbearable burden for an 11-year-old girl who had unknowingly unleashed a monster on her schoolmates. It was not a burden she could cast off with a sigh of relief. And it was not something the movies cared to show. Yet in the pages of J.K. Rowling's book, there is a quiet, powerful figure who did not look away from his sister's pain. That figure was Ron Weasley. Ron, often reduced in the films to the role of comic relief or loyal sidekick, showed another side of himself during this quiet chapter of recovery. He did not make grand speeches or vow vengeance on Tom Riddle. He didn't try to erase the past or pretend nothing happened. What he did was far more difficult and infinitely more important. He stayed. He showed up for Ginny day after day, not as a savior, but as a brother. Ron understood something that even some adults often forget. When someone feels broken, they don't need a lecture or a solution. They need to feel safe again. They need laughter, warmth, familiarity. Ron gave Ginny that in the form of quiet companionship and subtle reassurances. Ginny, normally so lively, had retreated into herself after being rescued from the Chamber of Secrets. She ate little, spoke even less. The diary, enchanted by the remnant soul of Tom Riddle, had manipulated her, drained her, and nearly killed her. And worse, it had made her a threat to the very people she loved. The pain of realizing that she had hurt others, even if not by her own will, gnawed at her. She avoided eye contact with her brothers, felt too ashamed to speak to Harry, and cringed at the idea of returning to classes. But Ron didn't let her drown in silence. He didn't force conversation or ask her probing questions. Instead, he filled the empty space with small, familiar things. He brought her pumpkin pasties from the Great Hall when she didn't come down for meals. He showed her a charmed teacup he'd convinced Seamus Finnegan to make whistle the Hogwarts school song. He let her beat him at wizard chess 3 times in a row and never once accused her of cheating. In the book, it's not spelled out in dramatic prose, but Ron's actions speak volumes. Ginny seemed very quiet, but Ron stayed close to her, keeping her company, it notes, a line that may be brief but reveals a world of brotherly care. This was the same Ron who had descended into the depths of the chamber with Harry, risking his life for a sister who had been missing for hours. And now, having seen the horror of what she had endured, he became her anchor in the days that followed. He didn't treat Ginny as broken or weak. He treated her as Ginny. That made all the difference. In their moments together, she was not the girl who had nearly been killed by an ancient evil. She was his sister, someone worth laughing with, teasing and comforting, someone still whole, even after everything. In a particularly poignant scene, Ron sat beside Ginny by the fire in the Gryffindor common room while the others played Exploding Snap. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Instead, he gently passed her a chocolate frog and pointed out that one of the cards showed Merlin looking absurdly cross-eyed. Ginny chuckled just once, but the sound broke through days of haunted silence. That moment, too quiet and human to be cinematic, never made it into the films. But it should have. It was the first real step on her road back to herself. What the films failed to convey was the full weight of Ginny's emotional collapse, and more importantly, the full depth of Ron's support. In cinematic adaptations, visual drama often wins over emotional intimacy, but the reality is that heroism isn't always about fighting monsters or breaking spells. Sometimes it's sitting next to someone who feels ruined and letting them know they're not alone. Ron's behavior wasn't loud or flashy. It was gentle, consistent, and deeply human. He saw his sister in pain and made it his quiet mission to help her breathe again. And it wasn't always easy for Ron. He was only 12 himself. He'd just been through a trauma of his own, nearly crushed by falling rocks and watching his best friend duel with the memory of a 16-year-old Dark Lord. He had his own nightmares to battle. But even amid his own fear and exhaustion, he reached outward. He turned his attention to Ginny, not out of obligation, but out of love. That's what makes his actions so meaningful. Ron wasn't simply checking a box marked good brother. He was following an instinct as old as family: protect, comfort, restore. In one scene, Fred and George attempted to cheer Ginny up by pretending to faint every time they saw her, jokingly blaming her for being too scary to look at. It was an awkward, misguided attempt at humor. Ginny didn't laugh. She turned pale and fled the room. Ron didn't yell at the twins. He simply followed Ginny, found her curled up behind a chair in the common room, and sat beside her. "They don't mean it," he said softly. "They just get sometimes." She didn't reply, but she leaned her head against his shoulder. He let her stay like that for as long as she needed. This was Ron without an audience, Ron without a punchline, Ron who wasn't trying to be the best friend, or the brave lion of Gryffindor, or the master strategist of the chessboard. This was Ron, the older brother, something we rarely see in the films, but which the books never forget. When Ginny had no voice, Ron became her voice of comfort. When she had no strength, he became her strength. And when the world expected her to move on, he allowed her to feel every ache, every tremor, without rushing her through it. Ron's character is often judged by his loudest moments, his tantrums, his mistakes, his jealousy. But it's in the quiet where his truest self resides. When Ginny trembled under the weight of her own memories, Ron did not try to erase them. He helped her carry them, slowly, carefully, without pressing. The films gave us a Ron who panicked at spiders and shouted about sandwiches. But the books gave us a Ron who understood grief and how to sit beside it without trying to fix it. It's no coincidence that Ginny recovered. Her strength was her own, but it was nurtured in the shadow of Ron's care. With each silly joke, each soft word, he helped rebuild her confidence. He reminded her who she was, not a pawn, not a victim, but a Weasley, someone brave, someone loved. And through that process, Ron showed an emotional intelligence that's easy to overlook but impossible to overstate. He didn't dismiss Ginny's pain, didn't try to distract her with empty noise. He met her where she was and waited there with her. There's something profoundly moving about the way Ron quietly refused to let Ginny disappear into her guilt. He didn't let her story end in that chamber. He helped her begin again. This small chapter, buried between the more dramatic moments of magical duels and phoenix feathers, is one of the most intimate acts of love in the entire series. And it belongs to Ron, not the boy who always says the wrong thing, but the brother who, when it mattered most, said exactly the right thing by simply being there. When we talk about what makes a hero, we often focus on the moments of action. But in Ginny's case, it wasn't the basilisk fang or the sword of Gryffindor that healed her. It was Ron, his presence, his patience, his humor, his refusal to abandon her when she felt most unworthy. He didn't need a prophecy or a wand to change her world. He just needed to be her brother. And in doing so, he became something much more than Harry's best friend. He became Ginny's lifeline. As the summer came and Hogwarts emptied, Ginny was no longer the pale, quiet girl who feared her own shadow. She laughed more easily, ate with the others, joined in the games on the lawn. And Ron, still loud, still goofy, still himself, grinned every time she smiled. Because he knew what it cost her to smile again. He'd been there in the dark, and now he stood beside her in the light. That is the part the films missed. But the books remember, and so should we. Number 18 gave Hermione the tales of Beedle the Bard. Of all the scenes that never made it to the screen, one quiet Christmas moment in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows stands out for its emotional depth and symbolic weight. Deep in the forest, during the darkest winter of their journey, Ron Weasley gives Hermione Granger a gift, a simple book, a small, worn volume of wizarding tales, the tales of Beedle the Bard. It is not wrapped. There is no fanfare. He simply gives it to her, and she accepts it with a quiet understanding that transcends words. This fleeting act of thoughtfulness, easily missed among the grander gestures and battles, is one of the most important character moments for Ron, and it never made it into the films. They were camping in the Forest of Dean at the time, worn down by months of uncertainty. The snow had blanketed the forest floor, their breath hung in the air like mist, and the atmosphere was thick with tension and sadness. It was during these days that Ron returned after abandoning Harry and Hermione, his heart bruised with guilt and remorse. This gift was not just a present. It was an olive branch, a soft apology, and a declaration of who Ron really was beneath the insecurities that so often defined him. Ron knew books mattered to Hermione more than almost anything else. He had watched her cling to knowledge, to structure, to logic, in a world that so often defied those very things. He remembered the way her eyes lit up in the Hogwarts library, the way she spoke passionately about the importance of history, tradition, and truth. He understood in his own quiet way that stories were not just stories for her. They were sacred, guiding lights in a chaotic world. Giving her the tales of Beedle the Bard was not just a thoughtful gesture, it was a sign that he saw her completely. It was not easy to come by the book. The tales of Beedle the Bard was not something that could be found lying around in the snow or stashed among their supplies. It had been entrusted to Hermione by Albus Dumbledore himself, through his will, but Ron had made a point of retrieving it when he returned. He had remembered it, remembered her, remembered that she loved that book before she even opened its cover. It wasn't about owning it, it was about what it meant, that she was trusted, that she had a role to play, and that the magic of childhood stories still had power in a world dominated by darkness. She had told Ron once that the tales of Beedle the Bard were the wizarding equivalent of Muggle fairy tales. She spoke of them with a wistfulness in her voice, like someone longing for a world where stories end happily and good always triumphs. The inclusion of this particular book was no accident in the grand design of the story. Dumbledore had passed it to Hermione for a reason, and Ron, who often played the fool, saw the significance before most. He knew the book wasn't just parchment and ink. It was a riddle, a key, a map to a deeper truth. And still he chose to give it to her. That moment could have been a turning point on screen, a way to show Ron's emotional intelligence. Instead, the films reduced Ron to comic relief and jealousy. But in the books we see the full spectrum of his growth. When he gives Hermione the book, he does not try to impress her. He does not ask for praise, he simply gives. The gesture is so simple, so quiet, it almost vanishes among the chaos of their mission, but it reveals more than any dramatic speech ever could. Ron cares deeply, and he expresses it in the only way he knows how, by noticing the small things. J.K. Rowling captures this moment with a kind of quiet reverence. Hermione was touched, the book says. That is all. But those 3 words carry the weight of pages. She does not gush, she does not cry. She simply receives it with the grace of someone who has been seen. This is what love looks like in its rawest form. A boy handing a girl a book in the middle of a war, because he knows it will matter to her more than anything else he could give. This was the same Ron who had once mocked her for knowing too much, the same Ron who had rolled his eyes at Spew and frowned at her sense of justice. But here, in this single act, we see how far he has come. He is no longer threatened by her intellect. He respects it. He wants to nurture it, and perhaps, in giving her the tales of Beedle the Bard, he is also giving her back a piece of herself, reminding her that even in war there is still room for wonder. The irony, of course, is that this book ends up being the key to everything. The tale of the 3 brothers hidden within its pages unlocks the mystery of the Deathly Hallows. It contains the fable that ultimately explains Voldemort's obsession and Dumbledore's regret. It is the bridge between myth and reality, between childhood stories and adult truths. And Ron, without knowing the full depth of its importance, is the one who gives it to her. That is the genius of the moment. He acts not out of strategy, but out of love. And that love, unknowingly, sets the course for the final chapter of their journey. Had the films included this scene, it would have added a layer of richness to Ron's character that was sorely missing. Instead of reducing him to a sidekick, this moment would have framed him as a boy of great heart, capable of deep insight. It would have reinforced the theme that heroism is not just in duels and curses, but in acts of empathy. Ron's gift to Hermione was not just thoughtful, it was transformative. It made her pause, it made her feel valued. And in a time when hope was in short supply, that mattered more than magic. This scene also serves as a quiet rebuttal to those who questioned Ron and Hermione's relationship. Critics have argued for years that Hermione should have ended up with Harry, citing compatibility and shared values. But moments like this show why Ron was the right choice. He knew her in ways that mattered. He understood what comforted her, what inspired her. He didn't need to be her intellectual equal, he needed to respect her mind, and he did. This was not a flashy romance. It was built on small, consistent acts of understanding. In the larger arc of the story, the tales of Beedle the Bard becomes a symbol of everything the trio is fighting for. It represents heritage, culture, memory. Voldemort rejects it because he sees no value in stories, in allegory, in moral parables. But Ron, who has grown up on these tales, sees the value even when he doesn't understand it fully. In giving the book to Hermione, he is passing on a torch of belief in something bigger than themselves. He is preserving the past in the hope that it might protect the future. Hermione's reaction is also crucial. She does not squeal with delight or react theatrically. She simply smiles, holds the book close, and thanks him. It is one of the few times she does not feel the need to analyze, critique, or correct. she just accepts. And in doing so, she allows Ron's quiet love to land uninterrupted. For two characters whose relationship is often defined by bickering and miscommunication, this is a rare and beautiful moment of synchronicity. Their journey is long, dangerous, and filled with suffering. But these small moments of tenderness, unremarkable to the outside world, are what keep them grounded. Ron's gift is a small act of rebellion against despair. It says, "I see you. I remember what you love. I want you to have something beautiful." That, in itself, is magic, the real kind, not learned from books or taught in classrooms, but born from the human spirit. This moment is also a microcosm of Ron's larger arc. He begins the series as a boy overshadowed by his siblings, by Harry, by the world. He is unsure of his worth, often jealous, often insecure. But by the end, he has become someone capable of extraordinary kindness, not because he changed who he was, but because he leaned into it. He became more of himself. Giving Hermione the book is not a grand gesture. It is a Ron gesture, modest, deeply felt, sincere. There is an irony in the fact that a book-loving girl receives the most important book in the story not from a headmaster or a hero, but from a boy who struggled with academics. But that is the point. Ron may not have been top of the class, but he had emotional intelligence in spades. He noticed things others missed. He cared in ways that could not be measured in owls or new teas. That was his gift, and it made all the difference. In the chaos of war, their world is breaking down around them. They are hunted, starving, frightened. But in the middle of that, Ron gives her a storybook. He is saying, stories still matter, love still matters, you still matter. That is the heart of the entire series, that even in the darkest of times there is still light, and sometimes it comes in the form of a boy handing a girl a book on Christmas. The omission of this scene from the films is a loss not just for fans of Ron, but for the integrity of the story. It was a turning point, a moment that crystallized everything they were fighting for. It was about friendship, love, memory, and the quiet power of tradition. In a story filled with explosions and curses, it was a gentle reminder that the smallest moments often carry the greatest meaning. And so as they sat together in the cold, with the fire flickering and the world growing ever darker, Ron's gift became more than paper and ink. It was a lifeline, a reminder that the world was once full of bedtime stories and brave little children who believed in magic. And maybe, just maybe, it still could be. Number 19 endured the Horcrux's influence and returned. Of all the overlooked moments in the Harry Potter films, few feel as unjust as the omission of Ron Weasley's defining trial under the Locket Horcrux's influence. The cinematic version offers only a shadow of what the book portrays, reducing Ron's inner torment to a moment of impulsive departure. But in J.K. Rowling's novel, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Ron's story is layered with fear, courage, and redemption. What is often dismissed as weakness becomes, in truth, a tale of deep psychological endurance, and the destruction of the Horcrux is a transformative act that reshapes Ron as a character. His return is not a simple apology. It is a confrontation with his darkest fears and a victory earned through immense inner strength. The Locket Horcrux is unlike any ordinary cursed object. Crafted by Lord Voldemort, it contains a fragment of his very soul, and it feeds on human vulnerability. Its magic is designed not only to torment the wearer, but to break them entirely. When Ron, Harry, and Hermione begin to carry the locket during their bleak journey through forests and fields, the toll it takes becomes brutally clear. Each of them feels the locket's influence, but Ron suffers the most, not because he is the weakest, but because he is the most human. The locket senses insecurity, and in Ron it finds fertile ground. Decades of living in his older brother's shadows, years of quiet jealousy toward Harry, and a heart deeply afraid of never being enough for Hermione. In the book, Ron's growing agitation is not sudden. It is a slow, cruel corrosion. He becomes irritable, paranoid, and withdrawn. The locket whispers to him in the silent hours when firelight flickers and the wind howls through trees. It tells him he's unwanted, that Harry and Hermione are better off without him. It twists his perceptions until even kindness feels like condescension. He must have known, Rowling writes, deep down that he was being unreasonable, but the locket fed off every flicker of doubt. And so when he finally leaves the camp, it is not cowardice, it is the breaking point after a long siege on his sanity. But what the movie fails to show is that Ron doesn't stay gone. In the book, his return is not just a change of heart, it is an act of redemption earned through fire. Guided back by the Deluminator, Dumbledore's final gift, Ron does not simply stumble upon Harry and Hermione. He follows the echo of Hermione's voice, proof of the love he still carries, even after believing himself to be unloved. In the freezing forest, he hears Harry's voice calling from beneath a frozen lake, trapped and drowning under the very locket that poisoned their friendship. Ron doesn't hesitate. He dives into the icy water, driven by the same courage that once put him in front of a giant chess piece in his first year. Dragging Harry from the lake is only the beginning. The true trial awaits, the destruction of the Horcrux. This task is not a matter of brute strength, but of emotional endurance. Ron must destroy the object that nearly destroyed him. When Harry opens the locket with Parseltongue and hands Ron the sword of Gryffindor, the scene becomes a symbolic reckoning. The Horcrux defends itself by conjuring illusions, visions tailored to crush Ron's soul. He sees Harry and Hermione wrapped in an embrace, mocking him, claiming they were always meant to be. He hears his mother's voice telling him he's a disappointment. These are not spells, but manifestations of real fears, pulled from the deepest recesses of his mind. The moment is shattering. Rowling does not spare Ron in her prose. She describes how he falters, how the vision makes him hesitate. Ron raised the sword in trembling hands, she writes. His skin was wet, his hair plastered to his face, his eyes were on the Horcrux. There is no glory in the moment, only pain, fear, and an overwhelming desire to be free of it. And then he strikes. The locket screams. The illusions vanish. The piece of Voldemort's soul dies, not by magic, but by Ron's refusal to let it define him. This is not just an act of destruction, it is an act of self-liberation. Harry, stunned and grateful, tries to express what this meant, but Ron, ever modest, brushes it off. The films reduce this victory to a few seconds, leaving out the emotional gravity. They do not show how close Ron came to losing himself, or how deeply he had to dig to rise above it. They miss the detail that Ron's torment was crafted specifically for him, personalized psychological warfare, and that surviving it meant confronting every shadow cast on him since childhood. His action was not reactionary, it was premeditated bravery. It matters that Ron was the one to destroy that particular Horcrux. Of all the trio, he was the one most poisoned by it. If Harry had done it, it would have been efficient. If Hermione had done it, it would have been logical. But Ron doing it, after being nearly broken by it, makes it an act of triumph. It proves that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to overcome it. Ron may never be the chosen one or the brightest witch of his age, but in this moment, he is the one who faces Voldemort's soul and wins. This turning point is also crucial to Ron and Hermione's relationship. The locket's illusions target Ron's belief that Hermione prefers Harry, a fear that had simmered for years, never voiced but always present. To see it play out in magical torment forces Ron to confront it. And surviving that vision, then returning to Hermione, not to confront her but to stand by her, marks the beginning of his emotional maturity. It is a quiet but profound evolution of love, not driven by possession or jealousy, but by understanding and choice. When Hermione learns that Ron found his way back by hearing her voice through the Deluminator, she is momentarily speechless. Her reaction is not just surprise, it is revelation. For the first time, she understands the depth of Ron's feelings, and that his love for her is not loud or theatrical, but patient and real. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifts. Their later kiss in the Room of Requirement is not sudden. It is the culmination of trials that began with Ron choosing to destroy the part of himself that doubted he was worthy of love. In a story so often centered on prophecy and power, this moment is about personal choice. Ron chooses to come back. He chooses to act. He chooses to face the thing that nearly undid him. There is no external compulsion. No prophecy demands it. Dumbledore's plan allows room for free will, and Ron's choice matters because it is his alone. The movie fails to emphasize this, turning a deeply personal victory into a narrative beat, moving quickly to the next obstacle. But in the book, Rowling lets the weight linger. It is also telling that the sword Ron uses was once used by Godric Gryffindor, a relic of bravery passed down through time. Only a true Gryffindor can wield it, and Ron's ability to do so reaffirms what the Sorting Hat saw in him as a child. Not just bravery in the face of physical danger, but bravery to fight the demons inside. The sword responds to courage, and Ron's moment of action proves he is no sidekick. He is a hero, not by fame or power, but by will. The forest scene, filled with dark water and ancient magic, is one of Rowling's most hauntingly beautiful creations. It is both literal and symbolic, death and rebirth. Ron dives into the cold and emerges not only having saved Harry, but having reclaimed himself. The locket is destroyed, but so is something else, the version of Ron that believed he was second best. In its place stands someone who no longer doubts his value, not to Harry, not to Hermione, and not to the cause they're fighting for. In removing this depth from the film, the opportunity was lost to explore male vulnerability in a meaningful way. Ron's suffering is not weakness. It is a mirror held to every fear young people carry, of not being good enough, of being replaceable, of failing the people they love. His victory shows that these feelings can be confronted and conquered. The sword is a weapon, yes, but Ron's real strength is the resolve to use it despite everything in him screaming to run. The scene also underscores the trio's strength, not as individuals, but as a collective. Harry's trust in Ron to destroy the Horcrux shows forgiveness. Ron's willingness to return shows love. Hermione's reaction shows belief. They are stronger together, not because they are flawless, but because they survive each other's flaws. The Horcrux tried to break them apart, and it nearly succeeded, but the fact that Ron came back and destroyed the very object that made him leave is the story's quiet masterpiece. J.K. Rowling did not write Ron as comic relief. She wrote him as a boy learning how to be a man, not through battles or duels, but through emotional honesty. His journey is subtle and human. The Horcrux scene is his crucible. It shows that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through frozen breath, trembling hands, and the refusal to believe the voices of doubt. And in those pages, Ron Weasley becomes unforgettable, not just as a friend to the hero, but as one in his own right. Number 20. Rebuilt trust with Harry after their fight. In the chill of winter, under the thick cover of a frosty forest, Ronald Weasley returned, not as the confident boy who once laughed over butterbeer at the Three Broomsticks, but as a young man marked by shame, loss, and a yearning to repair what had been shattered. His departure had not only broken the physical trio that had survived countless dangers, but had fractured something more delicate: trust. When Ron walked away, influenced by the malevolent whispers of the Horcrux, he didn't merely leave a campsite behind. He left behind the loyalty of friendship, the invisible pact, forged through years of trials, and most painfully, he left Harry Potter. It's easy to forgive with a smile in a movie. The screen blinks and hearts mend as if pain were a temporary inconvenience. But books demand truth. And in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the truth was that forgiveness is earned, not granted. Ron didn't simply walk back into Harry's arms. He returned to silence, to suspicion, and to the unspoken knowledge that trust, once burned, leaves behind an ache that no apology can instantly soothe. When he emerged from the icy pond, having rescued the sword of Gryffindor and destroyed the locket Horcrux, it wasn't redemption. It was the beginning of a slow climb toward it. Ron had always been the most human of the trio. He doubted, feared, envied, and loved with all-consuming intensity. When he left, it was not out of hatred or betrayal, but exhaustion, insecurity, and the venomous influence of the locket, which magnified every hidden fear. He feared being second best, feared being unwanted, feared that Harry and Hermione could go on without him. The Horcrux didn't invent these fears. It merely turned up the volume. But when he left, Ron made a choice, and that choice cost him everything until he decided to fight to earn it back. When he returned, Harry was stunned, grateful even. But there was a pause, unspoken and weighted. Ron sensed it, that stiffness in Harry's voice, the slight delay in their laughter. The reunion wasn't joyous, it was necessary. Hermione, more than anyone, carried the fury of abandonment. Her coldness was ice, forged in pain, and Ron had to wade through it, day after day, to prove that he was no longer the boy who walked away. He became gentler, more aware, and most notably, he began to lead, not just follow. In the film adaptation, the moment of Ron's return is brief, almost comforting. The tension dissolves in a matter of seconds. Harry embraces Ron, the sword gleams, and the story charges forward. But in the novel, J.K. Rowling does not grant Ron the luxury of easy absolution. His re-entry into the group is a process. He tells Harry, "I wanted to come back the minute I'd left. I just didn't know how to find you." The words don't erase the absence, but they illuminate the agony Ron endured during the separation. He didn't leave to hurt them. He left because he was hurting. Throughout the days that followed, Ron changed. He began waking early to help prepare food, though his cooking was clumsy at best. He volunteered to keep watch during the coldest hours of the night, often choosing the shift no one else wanted. He fetched water, chopped firewood, and even tried to clean their tent, despite being utterly useless at household charms. These gestures were small, but they were meaningful, not because the tasks were difficult, but because Ron was quietly saying, "I'm here. I'm not leaving again." Perhaps most poignantly, Ron became the voice of caution and empathy. When Harry's obsession with Godric's Hollow threatened to derail their already fragile plans, Ron was the one who raised questions, but no longer with the combative tone of someone who doubted. Instead, he asked with care, thinking through the consequences. He didn't seek control, he sought harmony. His instincts began to align with responsibility, and responsibility was something Ron had often shied away from. One of the most striking examples of Ron's new maturity came after Harry's disastrous trip into Bathilda Bagshot's house when they narrowly escaped Nagini and Voldemort. While Harry lay in shock and Hermione was in tears, it was Ron who quietly began patching Harry's wounds. He didn't ask for praise. He didn't even explain how he knew what to do. He simply did it. That was the shift. Ron had stopped trying to prove he was essential. Instead, he became essential by being dependable. The Ron who came back was different. He had seen what it felt like to lose everything: friends, safety, purpose. And instead of returning to his old role as the comic relief or sidekick, he returned with self-awareness. He no longer needed to be the center of attention. Instead, he centered others. He began listening more, interrupting less. And when Hermione spoke about the Deathly Hallows, Ron didn't scoff as he once might have. He listened, he asked questions, he took notes. It was the smallest of details, but one of the most telling. Rowling doesn't romanticize Ron's path to redemption. She lets him suffer. She makes him confront Hermione's fury without flinching. She forces him to see the damage he caused, to sit in the tension, and to choose each day to rebuild. That's what makes Ron's arc so deeply resonant. Anyone can say sorry, Few can live the apology. Even their conversations changed. Harry noticed that Ron spoke more thoughtfully, often breaking silences with jokes not meant to distract, but to uplift. He remembered Harry's birthday with a radio he'd stolen from the Snatchers and repaired. He tried to make Harry smile, not to seek forgiveness, but to remind him that even in war there could be joy. It was Ron's way of giving back the warmth he'd taken when he left. The change in their relationship was subtle, but profound. There was a new equality between Harry and Ron, forged not just by battle, but by honesty. Harry no longer felt he had to carry every burden alone, and Ron no longer feared being irrelevant. When they argued, it was no longer out of competition, but frustration. When they laughed, it was no longer careless, it was earned. They had seen the worst in each other and decided to stay anyway. In the final battle, it's this trust that anchors them. When they infiltrate Gringotts, Harry entrusts Ron with a vital role, not out of necessity, but out of confidence. When they return to Hogwarts, it's Ron who suggests freeing the house elves, a moment of compassion that shocks Hermione and delights readers. Ron was not simply maturing, he was transforming. But perhaps the most telling moment of Ron's redemption comes not in action, but in reflection. As they walk through the ruins of Hogwarts after the battle, Ron doesn't boast of his bravery. He doesn't point to his sacrifices. He simply stays close to Harry and Hermione, quieter than usual, eyes wide with grief and awe. He knows what it cost to win, and he knows now, deeply, what it means to be part of something greater than himself. The scene with Ron, which never made it into the film, isn't one moment. It's a thread, a slow, painful, beautiful weave of humility, remorse, and growth. It's not cinematic in the traditional sense. There's no grand gesture, no sweeping music, but it is deeply human. It's in the way Ron lowers his voice when Hermione speaks, the way he moves slightly closer to Harry when danger approaches, the way he stops complaining, stops seeking validation, and starts becoming the man we all hoped he would be. This story arc matters because it reminds us that people fail. They fall, they walk away, but they can also return. They can apologize, grow, and be better. Ron Weasley didn't become a hero because he was flawless. He became one because he learned from his flaws, because he chose to face his own disappointment, not with bitterness, but with bravery. And so, while the film gives us a Ron who returns with a smile and is instantly embraced, the book gives us something richer. It gives us a Ron who stumbles back, bruised and uncertain, and walks the long road back to friendship. He rebuilds, brick by brick, the fragile trust he once took for granted. And when that trust is finally restored, it is stronger than ever, not because it was never broken, but because it was broken, and then healed. Ron's journey back into Harry's trust is not just a subplot. It is a quiet masterpiece of character development, too complex and tender for the silver screen to hold. But in the pages of the book, it breathes, it aches. And it reminds us all that redemption is not a moment, it is a process. One that Ron Weasley, in all his imperfection, undertakes with courage, grace, and deep, enduring love. Number 21. Stood by Hermione after she erased her parents' memories. The decision Hermione Granger made that evening was one no teenager should ever face. With trembling hands and a mind sharpened by fear, she stood in the living room of her parents' quiet home, wand gripped tight. The photographs along the walls, sun-drenched images of beach holidays, school plays and family dinners, blurred before her eyes. She was about to erase her own existence from the lives of the people who loved her most. And she did it without witness, without applause, and most cruelly, without goodbye. She whispered the spell softly, "Obliviate," and in that instant, Mr. and Mrs. Granger forgot they had a daughter. It was a moment buried in the text of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, offered with devastating simplicity. But what followed, what the films chose not to show, was just as crucial, just as human, and just as painfully beautiful. Hermione returned to the burrow soon after, pale and hollow-eyed. She didn't mention what she had done right away. She said little, not from secrecy, but because grief robbed her of language. The decision to protect her parents by erasing herself from their lives was an act of love so profound that even the other members of the trio, battle-hardened as they were becoming, could only stand back in reverence. It wasn't until the quiet hours of the evening, when the burrow had dimmed into golden lamplight and the wind rustled the hedges outside, that Ron noticed something was different about Hermione's silence. It wasn't the usual tension that hung between them like sparks in dry air. It was something heavier, more permanent, like the weight of absence. Ron Weasley had never been known for eloquence. He tripped over words the way others tripped over furniture. But he was learning, slowly, to listen, not just with his ears, but with his whole being. When he saw Hermione sitting in the garden alone, eyes fixed on nothing, hands clenched into her robes, he didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for her. Her pain was a presence, thick and invisible, and Ron, unsure of what to say, simply walked toward it. He didn't bring a chair, he didn't sit apart. He sank down into the damp grass beside her, brushing shoulders. For a long while they both sat still, watching the stars blink open across the sky like eyes. Hermione didn't cry, her grief was past tears, but she leaned slightly into Ron almost imperceptibly, and he shifted to meet her weight, offering himself as ballast. That was all. No confession, no consolation, just a boy and a girl, alone in the garden, sharing the unbearable quiet of a sacrifice made in solitude. There was no witness to this moment. No one in the house saw the way Ron's fingers grazed the back of her hand, not to hold it, but just to let her know he was there. No one heard the way his breathing matched hers, slow and steady, anchoring her to the present. But Hermione would remember that stillness more clearly than any speech. Later, in the middle of some forest, running for her life, she would recall the warmth of Ron's sleeve against hers, and it would make her brave again. In the book, Hermione mentions her decision almost in passing. I've also modified my parents' memories so that they're convinced they're really called Wendell and Monica Wilkins, and that their life's ambition is to move to Australia, she tells Harry and Ron, Deathly Hallows, Chapter 6. The clinical tone barely masks the depth of the wound. What the book allows us to imagine, but the films omit, is the way Ron reacts to this confession, not with shock, not even with praise. He simply looks at her for a long moment, and in that look is an ocean of recognition. He understood, in that instant, that Hermione was not just brave, she was a warrior of a different kind, someone who didn't need a wand to destroy Horcruxes. She had destroyed a piece of her own soul to keep others safe, and Ron, so often treated as comic relief or the sidekick, rose to meet her, at her level. Not with jokes, not with clumsy attempts at cheer, but with quiet solidarity. This was not a grand gesture, it was not meant to impress, and perhaps that's why it mattered so deeply. Ron had always known how to fight for his friends in battle. But here, in the garden, with no Death Eaters or Dementors in sight, he fought a different kind of fight, the fight to hold space for someone else's pain. He became the friend, the partner, the protector Hermione didn't have to ask for. That's what makes this scene so unforgettable, even though it was never filmed. The films chose to highlight Ron's heroism in battle, his humor, and his jealousy. But they trimmed away these quiet, essential pieces of his character. This was the Ron who understood that love is not only about standing up for someone, but also about sitting down beside them when they cannot stand on their own. This was the Ron who didn't flinch from emotional messes, who didn't demand explanations. He gave Hermione what few people could, presence without pressure. He knew her well enough to understand that she didn't want to be told she was brave. She didn't need reminders of why she had done what she did. She needed someone to witness her sorrow without turning away. And Ron, in all his awkward, fiercely loyal simplicity, did just that. He stayed. It's easy to overlook this side of Ron because he so often hides behind sarcasm or food or irritation, but in moments like these he strips away the armor. He reveals the boy who loves with terrifying depth, who can recognize heartbreak in someone else's silence. This was not just about Hermione's pain, it was about Ron's capacity to hold it without needing to fix it. He did not try to reverse her spell, he did not offer false hope. He sat there, sharing the ache. In truth, this act of silent empathy may be more courageous than charging into the ministry or diving into the lake to save a friend, because emotional pain is harder to name, harder to confront. It requires a tenderness and strength that often go unrecognized. But Ron showed it without needing a spotlight. That is the heart of this missing scene, the one the films never gave us, but the books allowed us to feel between the lines. Even Harry, so often at the center of attention, could not have offered Hermione what Ron did that evening. Not because he lacked compassion, but because he was never as attuned to her inner world as Ron had grown to be. It was Ron who noticed when she grew quiet. Ron who kept pace with her moods. Ron who, despite his own fears and insecurities, reached out in moments when it mattered most. And this small, unglamorous moment, is where Ron Weasley becomes more than a sidekick. He becomes a partner. Later, when they were deep into the hunt for Horcruxes, when tensions frayed and tempers snapped, it was easy to forget the quiet strength Ron had shown in the beginning. But it never truly vanished. It lingered in the way he carried Hermione's bag without complaint, in the way he watched her from across the tent, scanning her face for signs of wear. It echoed in his voice when he finally returned, after leaving in a moment of weakness, and said, "I wanted to come back the minute I'd left." What they shared in the garden was not dramatic, but it was real. It was the kind of emotional intimacy that makes people brave enough to walk into the unknown. Hermione had already lost so much. She had given up her childhood, her home, and the people who had raised her. And in that moment, Ron gave her back something else, the knowledge that she was not alone. He didn't have the answers. He didn't pretend to, but he showed up. And sometimes that's all it takes to shift the weight of unbearable grief. His silence was not empty. It was full of understanding, of shared pain, of the kind of friendship that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. And Hermione, brilliant as she was, understood the value of that silence. She never thanked him with words, but she didn't need to. The way she leaned toward him, the way she allowed him to see her at her most vulnerable, was thanks enough. In the world they were about to enter, one filled with death, fear, and betrayal. This was the kind of bond that would keep them whole. The missing scene between Ron and Hermione, if it had been filmed, would not have required special effects or dramatic music. It would have required a quiet evening, a garden bench, and two actors brave enough to sit in stillness. And maybe that's why it was left out, because cinema is rarely patient with silence. But the books were. And in those silences, Rowling gave us the fullest picture of who Ron really was. He was not just the boy who made jokes, or the one who occasionally stormed off. He was the boy who stayed, who sat down beside someone when they were breaking and didn't try to fix them, who understood that real courage sometimes means holding your tongue and offering your shoulder instead. In this unspoken moment with Hermione, Ron became more than anyone had expected, and exactly what she needed. Number 22 supported Harry's decision to sacrifice himself. The forest was quiet, heavy with the weight of everything it had seen. Trees stood as ancient witnesses to magic and memory, and in the shadow of the battle they waited once more for a boy to walk toward his fate. But before Harry crossed into that silence, before he made his lonely journey into the forbidden forest to die at the hands of Voldemort, there was a moment, a small, subtle moment that did not make it into the films, but in the book spoke volumes. It was Ron Weasley's final act of friendship. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was pure, and it was essential. Ron had always been the one to voice doubt, to grumble under the weight of the task they carried. He had left them once, worn down by fear and jealousy, only to return stronger. He had always needed time to grow into the weight of who he was beside Harry Potter. But by the end, Ron no longer questioned. As the battle raged around them and Hogwarts trembled with the force of war, Ron knew what Harry was about to do, and unlike others who might have begged him to reconsider, Ron simply let him go. That moment was buried in the pages of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, and yet it might be one of the most powerful testaments to Ron's heart. Harry had the resurrection stone in his pocket and the weight of that knowledge in his chest. He was walking to die, not to fight. And as he slipped away, he didn't tell Hermione or Ron directly. But Ron looked at him, just looked, and something passed between them that needed no words. Rowling writes, "I'll go with you," said Hermione. "I'll go too," said Ron. But Harry refused them both. And they didn't press, they didn't argue, they simply let him go, their eyes filled with understanding. This scene was condensed in the films. The emotional depth was softened, the silence overlooked. In the movie, there is no moment where Ron simply watches Harry with that heartbreaking mix of fear, trust and sorrow. There's no pause where he realizes that his best friend is about to die and chooses to honor his decision. That kind of silence is too subtle for film, perhaps. But in the book, it echoes louder than any explosion. Ron Weasley, who once feared being second best, who feared being overshadowed, had grown beyond that. In the early years, Ron's insecurities had often made him reactive, jealous of Harry's fame, uncertain of his own worth. But here, in the final stretch, there was no envy left, no doubt. Just loyalty so deep it allowed space for sacrifice. He didn't need Harry to stay. He didn't need to hear the reasons. He simply accepted. There was something deeply mature in that gesture, because letting someone you love walk toward death when you know it's their choice and not fighting it takes more strength than charging into battle. Ron had seen Harry risk everything again and again. He had watched him break under the Horcrux's burden, stand up under Dumbledore's expectations, and lose people he loved. And now Harry was about to give up his own life. Ron knew, and he didn't stop him. Rowling's prose makes this clear, if quiet. She doesn't spell out Ron's thoughts, but through Harry's eyes we feel it, the respect, the grief, the unspoken farewell. The truth is, Ron didn't need to say goodbye. The very act of stepping aside was goodbye enough. He didn't offer false hope, he didn't scream, he didn't chase after Harry, he simply trusted him to know what was right. That was all Harry needed. This scene, though minimal in words, redefined Ron's journey. He was no longer just the comic relief, the sidekick. He had become a brother to Harry, not by blood, but by choice. He was someone who could feel the storm coming and not try to change its course, but instead honor the man standing in its path. His silence was love, and it cut deeper than anything he could have said. Fans who only watched the films might never understand the gravity of that moment. They never saw the look on Ron's face, the way his eyes mirrored Harry's resolve. They didn't get to feel the breathlessness of that pause before Harry turned away, or the quiet bravery in Ron not reaching out. That pause was everything, because in that moment Ron let go, not out of weakness, but out of reverence. It's easy to overlook moments of stillness in a story filled with battles, spells, and villains. But that stillness was the eye of the storm. That 1 second of mutual understanding when Ron's gaze met Harry's and said, "I know and I won't stop you," was the culmination of 7 years of friendship. A friendship forged in fire, tested in shadows, and now sanctified in silence. What makes it all the more powerful is the knowledge that Ron would have died for Harry. He had already risked everything, but he understood that this was not his fight, not this part. This was something Harry alone had to do, and Ron, fiercely loyal Ron, respected that. He knew when to fight beside his friend and when to step aside so that Harry could walk his own path. Hermione too understood, but her emotions burned hotter and her pain was closer to the surface. She hugged Harry fiercely, desperately, but Ron didn't. He stood still, his hands clenched, his eyes wide. It was not coldness, it was agony held in check, because he knew what Harry was doing, and he knew there was no stopping it. He didn't need to say goodbye, that would have been too much like surrender. It is Ron's growth, his emotional maturity, that makes this moment so haunting. He had become the friend who trusted you even when it meant losing you. He had become the man who could hold his grief in silence because it would only burden the one who needed strength to walk forward. He gave Harry something invaluable, permission. Permission to go, to die, to be brave. In this scene, we see that Ron is no longer the boy we met on the train, full of jokes and insecurity. He is a warrior in his own right, not because he cast a mighty spell or defeated an enemy, but because he held back, because he let go, because he knew that sometimes love doesn't cling, it releases. Had this moment been given the depth it deserved in the films, viewers might have understood Ron better. They might have seen that he wasn't just the loyal friend, but the quiet hero, the one who carried the weight of unspoken understanding, the one who stood in the shadows and let the light shine where it needed to, who said more in a single look than most could in a speech. When Harry entered the forest, he was not alone. The spirits of his parents, of Sirius and Remus, walked beside him. But in the moments before, it was Ron and Hermione who gave him the strength to take that step. Hermione's tears, Ron's silence, both gifts of love. But it was Ron's wordless support that anchored Harry, because it told him that his friends were ready to let him go, even if their hearts were breaking. It is easy to remember the grand moments, the final duel, the falling of Voldemort, the celebration of victory, but this scene, this almost invisible gesture, is what made the ending human. Without it, Harry's sacrifice might have seemed cold or distant. But with Ron's quiet eyes watching him go, it became personal, it became real. There are many ways to say goodbye. Some are loud, tearful, desperate. Others are simple, silent, and sacred. Ron chose the latter. And in doing so, he showed that real courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just standing still, letting someone go and hoping they come back. In the chaos of the battle, as spells lit up the sky and lives were lost, this moment between Harry and Ron was a still point, a breath, a blessing. It reminded us that love doesn't always need to speak, that true friendship isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go. Ron's silent approval, his decision not to interfere, was not an absence of action. It was a choice, a profound, painful, selfless choice. It was his way of fighting beside Harry one last time, not with wands or words, but with unwavering trust. That's the kind of magic that doesn't need a spell. And that's why, though the films left it behind, readers will never forget. Number 23 helped Harry find the lost diadem. In the dim corridors of Hogwarts, with war brewing in every echo, one scene quietly vanished from the films but remained vibrant in the pages of the final book. It was not an act of heroism in the typical sense, no spellcasting duel, no dramatic confrontation, but it was a moment that showcased Ron Weasley's unheralded brilliance. The moment when he, not Harry, cracked a vital piece of the puzzle, guiding the trio toward one of Voldemort's last Horcruxes. The diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw lay hidden, but without Ron's insight, it might have remained so. As the final battle for Hogwarts unfurled in chaotic waves, Harry struggled with the overwhelming weight of his mission. He had already destroyed several Horcruxes, each requiring sacrifice and sharp thinking, but he was not alone in this crusade. His companions, Ron and Hermione, had become his equals in danger and duty. Yet when it came to the films, this equality was not always preserved. In particular, the moment of clarity that belonged to Ron, his leap of intuitive logic about the room of requirement, was never captured on screen. It was Harry who led in the film, while in the book it was Ron's memory that turned the tide. As Harry stood in the ruins of a place he once called home, he began to piece together the mystery surrounding the final fragments of Voldemort's soul. He thought of Ravenclaw's lost diadem, something that had hovered in whispers and memories for months. But the castle was vast, and even with magical maps and connections to its ancient founders, the location of an artifact lost for centuries was no simple matter. It wasn't Harry who remembered where forgotten things went. It wasn't Hermione who offered the solution, even with her encyclopedic mind. It was Ron. Ron whose words cut through the fog of war with stunning clarity. Ron's revelation didn't come with fanfare or lightning bolts. It was a quiet triumph, but a powerful one. As they desperately searched for clues, he said, "What about the Room of Requirement?" Those few words, easily lost in the film's sweeping chaos, were in fact monumental. He remembered that Draco Malfoy had used the room to hide things. He recalled that it was a place where people stashed items they didn't want found. And with that memory, the path to the diadem unfolded. Ron's strength was never in arrogance but in connection, in observation, in lived experience, in memory. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the book narrates this critical moment without drama but with purpose. When Harry struggles to make sense of where the diadem could be, Ron's voice pierces through. "What if someone's already tried to get rid of it?" Ron said. "Like the way people used to sneak stuff into school and hide it there?" That suggestion wasn't just practical, it was visionary. It showed that Ron, often cast in the shadow of his best friend and the cleverest witch of their age, could see past the obvious and connect dots in ways no one else did. This wasn't a lucky guess. It was rooted in memory and logic. Ron remembered Malfoy's behavior during their 6th year, the way he kept disappearing, and how they'd eventually discovered that he had been using the Room of Requirement to move and hide things. That room had shown itself to be more than a trick of magical architecture. It was a vault of secrets, an archive of desperation. Ron's intuition was grounded in real events, not speculation. He connected present danger with past behavior and offered a lifeline that led straight to one of the most critical objects in the entire series. The Room of Requirement was not just a hiding place, it was symbolic. It required the right mindset to access. Only by walking back through memories, through patterns of behavior, and moments overlooked, could the trio even begin to locate it. Harry's mind had been too clouded with prophecy and pressure. Hermione, ever the scholar, looked to books and logic. But Ron remembered people. Ron remembered Hogwarts, not as a puzzle, but as a lived-in home full of habits, secrets, and places. That was his genius, and it is this type of genius that the films too often muted. The moment becomes even more significant when one considers the broader pattern of Ron's character. Time and again, he is the one underestimated, not only by others, but sometimes by himself. He jokes to mask his insecurity, plays the fool to fill the silence. But when the stakes are highest, when the world crumbles around him, he acts. He remembers. He suggests the impossible and makes it sound plausible. The Room of Requirement wasn't on anyone's list. It was buried in the back of 1,000 memories. But Ron had been paying attention. It is no exaggeration to say that without Ron, the Horcrux would have remained hidden. The diadem was not just a relic, it was a piece of Voldemort's soul. Its destruction was essential, and so was the route that led to it. While Harry's courage was legendary and Hermione's intelligence unmatched, it was Ron's human understanding of Hogwarts that filled in the map. The Room of Requirement was not marked by any spell or symbol, it revealed itself through need, and Ron recognized that need better than anyone. In the book, the journey into the Room of Hidden Things carries a weight that the films skimmed past. Harry is guided not by hunch or magic, but by the specific memory Ron triggers. They enter a vast chamber filled with the detritus of generations, including the poisoned cabinet Malfoy used, forgotten textbooks, crumbling furniture, and, perched above it all, the ancient diadem. Its location was not random, it was placed with purpose, as if waiting to be rediscovered by someone with the right eyes, and those eyes were not Harry's alone. The power of this moment lies not only in plot mechanics, but in character development. Ron is often seen as the sidekick, the comic relief, the loyal friend. But in this moment he is none of those things. He is the strategist, the historian, the observer. He remembers how things worked, not in abstract, but in action. He remembers Malfoy's guilt, Hogwarts rhythms, and the way secret things have always hidden in plain sight. In this way, Ron doesn't just help Harry, he empowers him. He gives direction to courage, clarity, to instinct. It is important to reflect on how the Room of Requirement itself works. It demands that a person truly needs what they seek. It does not yield its secrets easily, but it also reflects the mind of the seeker. In finding the diadem, Ron's presence was more than helpful, it was necessary. His practical nature grounded the group. While Harry's mind spiraled with images from Voldemort and Hermione recited historical facts, Ron simply said, "This is where I'd hide something." That kind of clarity in war is rare and vital. So much of Ron's arc is about growing out of the shadow, his brothers, his friends, even his own self-doubt. Yet in this moment, he stands tall. He is not reacting, he is leading, and it's this quiet leadership that the films failed to highlight. In choosing to focus on Harry's intuition and heroism, they cut away the very moments that made that heroism possible. Without Ron's voice, the trail to the diadem is colder, less personal, less believable. The book preserves that nuance. The film, unfortunately, does not. One can't help but wonder why this moment was omitted. Was it to streamline the narrative, to keep the spotlight on the titular character? Perhaps. But in doing so, the adaptation loses a layer of meaning. Ron's insight humanizes the magic. It reminds us that knowledge does not always come from books or visions. It can come from simply being present, from noticing things others don't. That is Ron's gift, and it deserved its due. Even within the narrative of friendship, this moment was telling. Harry trusted Ron. He didn't second-guess him, didn't overanalyze. When Ron said, "Try the Room of Requirement," Harry listened. That level of trust is not built on charisma or charm, it's earned through years of shared dormitories, detentions, disasters, and triumphs, through loyalty, tested and restored. In this single act of recollection, Ron justified every reason Harry ever had for calling him a brother. And when they finally find the diadem, perched like a crown on a pile of forgotten things, there is no trumpet of victory. There is only the quiet recognition that without Ron, they would not be here. That in the midst of chaos, it was memory, not magic, that led them. It is poetic, really. That something as ancient as a founder's relic should be found not through grand destiny, but through a friend's simple recollection of a place where lost things go. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem was meant to enhance wisdom, to elevate thought. How fitting, then, that it was Ron's mind, not his wand, that brought them to it. It wasn't logic puzzles or spellwork that solved this mystery. It was remembering where a foolish boy once hid a cursed cabinet. It was empathy wrapped in practicality, history remembered through emotion. That is a kind of magic the films forgot, but readers still carry in their hearts. Ron Weasley did not wear the crown. He did not destroy the Horcrux. He did not even carry it out. But without him, none of those things would have happened. He knew Hogwarts like a living friend, and in its final hour, that friendship lit the way. His knowledge was not flashy, but it was right, and that is the essence of his character: subtle strength, quiet wisdom, unshakable love. Years later, when fans revisit this scene, many do so with a sense of loss, not because of what happened in the book, but because of what was left out of the film. Ron's contribution matters. It always did. And in this moment, more than any other, it shines. Not because he was chosen, but because he chose to remember, to speak, to lead. That is what true bravery looks like. Not just facing the darkness, but lighting the path for others to walk through it. Ron did that. And though the screen may have missed it, the page remembers. And so do we. Number 24 asked Hermione to teach him lock spells. Of all the transformations in Harry Potter, Ron Weasley's is perhaps the most understated yet profound. While the films often portray him as comic relief or a loyal companion, riding the coattails of Harry and Hermione, the books, particularly the Deathly Hallows, offer a deeper, richer portrait of a young man wrestling with his place in a war, in a friendship, and in a world collapsing around him. One of the most telling moments of Ron's growth didn't make it into the films. It's a scene where, during the trio's bleak journey to destroy Horcruxes, Ron approaches Hermione with an earnest request. He wants to learn how to unlock magical locks. This isn't about idle curiosity. It's a moment of self-determination, of quiet rebellion against the feeling of uselessness that has haunted Ron for years. They are deep in the wilderness then, shifting campsites almost daily, moving under disillusionment charms, muffling their voices with muffliato, and living in a tent that offers more comfort than the bitter air outside. The mood is often grim. The locket Horcrux weighs heavily on their minds and on their hearts. Yet even amidst this gloom, Ron finds a pocket of clarity. He has seen too many moments where Hermione's quick thinking, her encyclopedic mind, and her dexterous wand work save them from traps and enchantments. And now, with Harry obsessed with visions of Voldemort and Dumbledore's past, Ron sees what he must become, not just a friend, but a contributor, a protector, a wizard who acts, not just reacts. He doesn't approach Hermione out of pride or pretense. He asks her to teach him, knowing that she is far ahead in spells and theory. This humility is its own kind of bravery. He wants to know Alohomora, not the basic version taught in first year, but the ways to detect if a lock has been tampered with, the kind of enchantments Death Eaters might use to guard entries, the layered spells that can trap a curious intruder inside the doorframe itself. Hermione obliges with that usual flicker of annoyance that he hasn't read the standard book of spells, grade 4, but her heart is softening too. She sees what Ron is doing. He's not boasting, he's preparing. There is a moment where Ron holds his wand toward the rusted latch of a shed they find in a forgotten forest glade. It's the shell of a hunter's outpost, long abandoned, but Hermione insists on treating every door as cursed. Ron tries Alohomora. The door does not budge. He tries again, his voice firmer. This time he feels resistance. Not from the wood or the hinges, but from the air itself, magic resisting his intrusion. Hermione tells him he's encountering a layered charm. Most would fail here, but Ron does not give up. He tries Descendium, though it's not designed for this lock. When that fails, he tries Finite, not to open the lock, but to cancel whatever charm is laid over it. It doesn't work, but Hermione nods approvingly. He's thinking now, trying combinations, not just repeating incantations blindly. This scene, buried in the pages of the Deathly Hallows passed over in the film, isn't about whether Ron succeeds in opening the door. It's about his refusal to be passive. For too long, Ron has stood beside brilliance, Hermione's, Harry's, even his older brothers. He's the sixth son of a poor family, always handed down something: robes, wands, expectations. And here, in a cold wood, with no one watching but the girl he's loved and admired for years, he is taking ownership of his fate. He is trying to be better. When Hermione first shows him the theory behind cursed locks, she references the work of Thaddeus Thirkell, a 19th century wizard who designed locks that retaliated against spellwork, with small but embarrassing jinxes. Ron listens with attention rare for him, asking questions that surprise her. He's not just absorbing the mechanics, he's visualizing them, imagining what kind of protections the Horcruxes might have. This isn't school anymore. The stakes are life and death, and he is acting accordingly. Later, in another campsite nestled under a rocky overhang, Ron asks if he can try disarming a magical seal Hermione conjures over a tin box. He spends an hour testing variations of unlocking charms. Sometimes he's too forceful, and the spell rebounds. Other times he's too hesitant and the spell fizzles, but he adjusts. He calibrates. He learns. And Hermione, for once, doesn't mock him. She offers encouragement, because she sees that this isn't just a distraction. This is Ron taking responsibility for the journey they're on. He is training himself to be the kind of man who doesn't freeze when Harry falls or Hermione is trapped, a man who can step in. This growth is quiet, unheralded, and yet so crucial. In the films, Ron's return after abandoning the group feels sudden. One moment he's gone, the next he's back, pulling Harry from a frozen pond and destroying the locket. But in the books we get moments like this one, small, powerful signs that Ron's journey is real. When he returns, he doesn't just apologize. He returns with determination, with understanding, with an evolved sense of duty. Scenes like this help explain that transformation. "I wanted to come back the minute I'd left," he tells Harry in the book. But before that, there is this determination to change himself, to be the kind of wizard who can break locks, not just follow someone else through the open door. This distinction matters. It's the difference between tagging along and leading, between surviving and fighting. The lockpicking lessons also deepen his relationship with Hermione. They move past the snide bickering of earlier years into a new terrain, one of respect. When she sees him trying, failing, and trying again, she no longer views him as the boy who copied her homework. He's someone she can trust. And that trust becomes the bedrock of what follows, through Malfoy Manor, through Gringotts, through the Battle of Hogwarts. There is a particular night, during one of their colder camps near the River Otter, when Ron manages to unlock a magically sealed drawer in a desk they salvaged from an abandoned shack. Inside is nothing but an old map and a dead spider, but Hermione claps for him anyway. He beams, not because of the reward, but because of the achievement. That drawer might have been nothing, but it might also one day be a prison or a lifeline. And now he knows he can reach it. This is Ron's story when no one is watching. This is growth without applause. It is the evolution of a boy who once broke wands and ate slugs into a man who can break magical barriers, a boy who feared inferiority becoming a man who dares to improve. His journey is not about brilliance or destiny, it's about effort, choice, and change. Ron always feared being overshadowed. "You're the famous one," he tells Harry once. "You're the cleverest girl in the year," he says to Hermione. But in this quiet subplot, he chooses to step into his own light. He wants to be the one who saves the day, not just stands beside the savior. And it is here, in these lock-breaking lessons, that we see his courage most clearly, not because he succeeds, but because he tries. These attempts, seemingly minor, ripple through their quest. Later, when they infiltrate Gringotts, it is Ron who recognizes the shifting enchantments on the Lestrange vault door. It's not that he casts the spell, but he sees the pattern. He remembers something Hermione said about nested locks and their tendency to collapse inward if broken in the wrong order. That memory slows them just enough to avoid triggering the worst trap. It's a moment built on preparation, on learning, on caring enough to try. The films give Ron hero moments, yes, but they miss these slower ones where the hero is forged in humility, not heat, where magic isn't just spectacle, but knowledge and effort and repetition, where a boy learns not just spells, but self-worth. That's why this scene matters, not because Ron becomes a master locksmith, but because he stops waiting for others to act. He picks up his wand and asks, "How do I do it?" And in that question lies everything, his vulnerability, his courage, and his future. This is not a boy defined by fear or failure. This is a boy forging himself into something new, something strong, something necessary. Hermione doesn't praise him with grand declarations. She offers something better, partnership. She trains him not like a pupil, but like a comrade. She corrects his wrist movements, suggests different inflections in the spell, and tells him stories of auras who specialized in breaking magical barriers. Ron absorbs it all. He doesn't become perfect, but he becomes prepared. When the final battle comes, Ron is not just wielding a wand, he's wielding all the knowledge, all the effort, all the practice he claimed in the woods. This includes the patience to try, fail, learn, and repeat. That drawer he opened, that door he failed to crack, all of it mattered, because it gave him what he needed most, belief that he could. This unseen scene, then, is more than a deleted moment. It is a metaphor for Ron himself, locked doors, hidden truths, barriers of doubt, all standing before him. And instead of waiting, he lifts his wand and begins. That is the Ron Weasley who survives. That is the Ron Weasley who matters. Number 25. First, to understand the room of requirement. In the labyrinthine corridors of Hogwarts Castle, where portraits whisper and staircases shift of their own will, there was one space more elusive than any other, a room that appeared only when someone truly needed it. This room, known as the Room of Requirement, became a sanctuary, a hideout, a battlefield, and a symbol of rebellion. But behind its discovery lies an overlooked truth, one erased by the simplifications of the film adaptations. Ron Weasley, so often dismissed as comic relief or sidekick, was the first to name the magic that led to it. His forgotten insight altered the course of the resistance against Dolores Umbridge, yet his contribution remains absent from the silver screen. It began in the shadow of fear, during the grim days of Harry's 5th year, when the Ministry's claws sank deep into Hogwarts. With Professor Umbridge appointed High Inquisitor, every sign of independent thinking was punished. It was Hermione who first suggested that they needed a secret place to teach defense against the dark arts, outside the Ministry's reach, far from Umbridge's listening spells and watchful eyes. But it was Ron who remembered the whisper, the anecdote, the flicker of something strange he'd once heard about a mysterious space within the castle walls. During one of their late-night conversations, as the three of them sat in the common room surrounded by whispers of rebellion and the crackling fire, Ron casually mentioned that Dumbledore had once spoken of a curious incident. He hadn't heard it from Dumbledore directly, of course, but through Fred and George, whose penchant for gossip rivaled their talent for chaos. According to Ron, the headmaster had stumbled upon a room he had never seen before, when, in desperation, he had been searching for a bathroom. What he found instead was a chamber filled with chamber pots, answering his need so precisely that it defied logic. J.K. Rowling writes in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore had told him that he had found a room full of chamber pots when he had really needed a bathroom. It was a strange detail, humorous on the surface, but layered with implications if one thought about it deeply enough. And Ron did. In that moment of offhand memory, he unlocked the path to one of the most significant locations in the fight against tyranny at Hogwarts. Harry, intrigued by the mention, seized on the clue. He began pacing hallways with intent, trying to replicate the circumstances described. It was not Hermione with all her intellect, nor Harry with his connection to the school's deeper magic, who uncovered the method. It was Ron's casual observation, his ability to remember the odd and the useful, that set events in motion. Without his contribution, the resistance might never have found a place to thrive, hidden away from prying eyes and cruel punishments. The Room of Requirement would become more than just a classroom. It would be the heart of Dumbledore's army, a refuge for young witches and wizards who refused to submit. And it all began with a memory Ron plucked from an offhand remark made years earlier. In the books, this moment of insight is subtle but clear. In the films, it's erased entirely. the credit for discovery shifting into ambiguity, with Harry seemingly stumbling into the room on his own, as if fate had simply gifted him another miracle. The omission is not merely unfair to Ron, it changes the narrative. In the books, Ron is not just comic relief or loyal sidekick. He is intuitive, present, and essential. He listens, he remembers, and he connects the dots when others are too distracted or overwhelmed to do so. His recollection is not framed as brilliance, but it has brilliance within it. It reflects a kind of intelligence that does not flaunt itself, but emerges at crucial moments, changing the course of events with quiet power. It is often Hermione who is praised for her encyclopedic knowledge and Harry for his bravery and instinct. But Ron's strength lies in his humanity, in his listening, his observing, his grounding in everyday Hogwarts lore. The Room of Requirement did not appear in a textbook, and it did not respond to bold declarations of intent. It responded to need, to circumstance, to those who paid attention to the castle's secrets. Ron, born and raised in the magical world, surrounded by stories, knew better than anyone that Hogwarts was alive in strange ways. His instinct to recall Dumbledore's chamber pot tale may seem accidental, but it was guided by an understanding forged in years of living among magic and mischief. When Harry finally found the room, the mechanics of it followed exactly what Ron had described. He paced past the blank stretch of wall 3 times while thinking intently about what he needed. A place to teach defense, a place to hide from Umbridge, a place where his friends could gather safely. The door appeared. Inside were cushions for practicing duels, books for spellwork, and enough space to host dozens. The magic of the room was astounding, but it answered to intention. Without Ron's clue, Harry may never have known to ask. The films chose spectacle over nuance, choosing to streamline events for clarity or runtime. But in doing so, they lost moments like these, moments where Ron shines not as the butt of a joke, but as the quiet observer who contributes something crucial. His omission from the discovery of the Room of Requirement is part of a larger trend that flattens his role, reducing his layered personality into something more palatable for a visual audience, but less truthful to the heart of the story. Ron's role in Dumbledore's army was not just as a follower, but as a catalyst. His insight opened the door, literally and metaphorically, to organized rebellion within the walls of a corrupted institution. The room became a beacon of hope, a place where young witches and wizards, trained for the battle they knew was coming, they cast Patronuses, deflected hexes, learned to trust one another. And all of it began with a remembered story about chamber pots, delivered with Ron's trademark mix of humor and sincerity. In a world where memory and knowledge are forms of power, Ron's contribution is no small thing. He embodies the value of listening, of collecting fragments of stories and jokes, and letting them live in the back of the mind until they are needed. He is a product of a magical upbringing, one where even a bizarre story about a room full of pots might turn out to be a life-saving clue. This kind of intelligence is rarely flashy, but it is real. It is the intelligence of connection, of recollection, of grounded magic. The Room of Requirement would later serve as the headquarters for the final resistance during the Battle of Hogwarts. It sheltered students, hid fugitives, and provided an escape route through the Hog's Head. All of its later significance traces back to its initial discovery. Ron's part in that legacy is written in the pages of the book, even if it was silenced in adaptation. It remains a powerful reminder of how history often forgets the contributions of those who speak softly, who joke as they guide, who don't demand credit but deserve it nonetheless. Ron has always been more than a punchline. He is the bridge between Harry's destiny and Hermione's logic, the one who grounds the trio in real-world experience. His loyalty is not blind, it is conscious and chosen. He doubts, he questions, but he remains. And when the time came for insight, not magic, not brilliance, but simple memory, he provided it. The scene in the book is brief, almost buried. Dumbledore told me once, Ron said, his voice muffled by the flicker of firelight and pages turning. He found a room full of chamber pots. No thunder cracked, no revelation sparkled. But in that simple recollection lay the seed of resistance. That is the nature of Ron's magic, quiet, human, and deeply consequential. By erasing this moment, the films unintentionally erased a truth about Ron Weasley. They took away the subtle proof that he was more than comic relief, more than the second in command. They ignored the kind of brilliance that does not wear a crown or hold a wand aloft, but instead emerges in a conversation, in a memory, in a joke shared between friends. This brilliance is harder to film, perhaps, but easier to recognize for those who have read the books closely. The room of requirement, that ever-shifting space of hope and defiance, owes its very first opening to a moment of remembered absurdity, a toilet story passed through whispers, brought forward by Ron. Without him, the door might never have appeared. Without that door, the army might never have formed. And without the army, Hogwarts might have remained under Umbridge's iron rule, its students fearful, its soul silenced. Every revolution begins with a spark, and sometimes that spark is not a shout or a prophecy or a grand spell. Sometimes it is a teenager with freckles and a tired voice remembering a ridiculous story his brother once told him. Sometimes it is the overlooked who change the world. Ron's legacy, then, is not just in friendship or loyalty, but in this. He paid attention. He remembered. He gave Harry and Hermione the key to the room of requirement, without seeking praise or glory. He did what needed to be done, and that, in the world of wizards and war, may be the greatest kind of magic there is.